You can't win your draft in the first few rounds, but you can lose it. Is that true? We're going to figure out how the best way to start your fantasy baseball draft is with Jenny Butler in a few minutes here on RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody, to the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Erik Halterman here with my guest, Jenny Butler of FTN Fantasy. We'll be talking about the very start of your fantasy draft, the first three rounds, the things to be thinking about during that part of the draft to set you up for the rest of the draft and the rest of the season. That's what we got on the menu for today. Jenny, how's your offseason been going? Are you ready for this big topic we got here?
I think I'm ready as I'm ever going to be. I haven't done as much drafting this offseason as I usually do. I decided to take my time a little bit and sort of wait and get fully ready before I start going. So this has been a really good exercise for me to start thinking about that stuff.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about some general points. Should you be avoiding all risks in the early rounds? Do you need to get an ace? Should you be open to pocket aces? Should you avoid closers? That sort of thing. We'll be talking about some specific builds that look interesting to us to start our teams. But before we get to that, as always, we want to talk about some of the headlines. It's been a bit of a slower news week, I would say, although we're about to get some exciting news. It seems like Roki Sasaki, the gem of the international free agent market, even though he's a well-established professional over in Japan, is down to, it seems, the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Toronto Blue Jays. According to rumors, it seems like the San Diego Padres, according to reporter Francis Romero, who's plugged into the international market, the Padres seem to be out on him. They're using their international dollars on other players. So I guess a two-part question here. For fantasy purposes, should we care where Roki Sasaki signs, Dodgers versus Blue Jays? And also, for fantasy purposes, just how excited are you for this guy?
I think that it's good to be pretty excited about him. I mean, obviously, as far as any other, quote unquote rookie, he is a bit of an unknown. But everything that I've heard from the people that know these things is made me pretty excited. I think the two teams that he's down to are both pretty good options. I mean, obviously the Dodgers are a juggernaut, but he's going to be in a little bit more of a crowded situation there, possibly a six-man rotation, that sort of thing. So maybe the Jays would be a little bit more free to let him pitch a little more. But everything that I've heard seems like he's, going to hit the ground running, and he's still young. And so I think that there's no reason to be anything but excited about him.
Yeah, well, the reasons would be things like, durability, and we haven't seen him yet. And that's going to be reasons why he's not going to go incredibly early in the draft. I'm just checking where he's gone in drafts since January 1st. If I have filtered this correctly, he is inside the top 100 now, pick 98. Going right in the same range as, say, Hunter Green, Tanner Bybee, Spencer Schwellenbach, Freddie Peralta. Would you be looking at Roki Sasaki, somebody who could strike out over 30% of batters, and who could have really, truly incredibly numbers? I mean, the sky's the limit with this guy based on what he's done over in Japan. But again, he also has some workload concerns and was sliding backwards last year, and we just haven't seen him. Is that a top 100 pick?
I think it seems about right. Everybody else that you just mentioned there has their own individual concerns. Hunter Green had a fantastic season last year, but can he repeat it, especially in Cincinnati, in that ballpark? Tanner Bybee's had his own injury issues and he's good. I don't know that he's like a world beater, but, Schwellenbach had a great when he, was great when he came up last year, but, we haven't seen him do it for a whole year. You don't know what he might regress to. So like everybody there, I think, has a little concern one way or the other, but they all have a lot of upside. So I think he sort of fits in that group.
Oh, I may have actually told a slight lie. I filtered it better and he's moved up since then.
Oh,
77
Ooh.
Since January 1st.
Now we're getting pricey.
ahead of those guys, just ahead of Shota Imanaga, Bryce Miller. I think even framing it this way, like I did, and telling you one thing and then telling you the other, makes it hard to get in on the new price. And honestly, that is what happens too. If you've been in these draft rooms and you've seen Roki Sasaki in November and December, you could have got him, late 100s, maybe even outside of 200 sometimes if you were really lucky, and the room just wasn't thinking about him. Now, not a chance. So it's really hard to adjust to the new draft position as he moves. And if he does sign, well, when he does sign anywhere, but particularly I think with the Dodgers would get people really excited.
Yeah.
Jumping.
Yeah, I mean, there gets to a point where the new shiny toy, the sexy pick becomes a little too much, and you just have, and you need to maybe talk yourself back a little bit. And there's always tends to be someone in the room who's just jacked up about this person, and so I often end up not drafting those people because the hype just gets a little out of control.
Yeah, I think that I am going to wind up regretting not landing him at that cheaper price. As always, you just never predict quite how far a guy's going to jump, and then always end up wishing you were on him before the jump happened. Let's talk about some less exciting players, but ones with a fantasy impact this season, certainly. Jeff Hoffman, the news the last few days after he signed with the Blue Jays is that multiple teams rejected him because his physicals, something in his shoulder, I believe it was. But the Blue Jays signed him anyway. They're okay with his physicals. And it seems like the Orioles and the Braves, the two teams that did flag his physicals, did still try to sign him after. So are you reading this as just, a negotiating ploy? Any pitcher probably has something a team can flag in his medicals if they want to say, well, actually, what if we paid you less than that? Is this the kind of thing that probably happens all the time? We're just only hearing about it in this case, or is this something we should actually pay attention to?
Yeah, I think that this is something that is just ripe for overreaction by the fantasy community. I mean, that's the thing that we like to do in the off season when we're a little bit starved for news. So, I think that it doesn't seem terribly concerning to me. I mean, we don't really know what failed a physical means. We don't know what they saw in the MRI. I saw a quote from Jeff Hoffman saying that the MRI was, quote, normal for me. So it's possible that, he has a little bit of structural damage here or there that he has been pitching with for a while, and it just doesn't look any worse than it used to. So, and like from what I've heard, no MLB pitcher has a clean looking MRI on their arm. Everybody's got something that they're dealing with. So I think that, it's quite possible when you hear the two teams that he supposedly failed a physical for, Atlanta and Baltimore, I would not think that either of them is looking for a closer. So they might have been looking for him to be a starter, and that maybe would have a little bit more, stronger requirements for, longevity and they want him to pitch more innings. So, maybe that was a little bit of a worry for them. And, any team that's looking to sign somebody to a multi-year contract is going to be a little bit more conservative. But for us as fantasy managers, we only need to worry about whether he's going to get through this year. And it seems like Toronto is going to use him as a reliever. So we really only need him to get through maybe 60 innings this year. So I don't think that it sounds terrible. I mean, as far as we know, he's not currently dealing with an injury, even though, I don't think that failed physical means he's currently dealing with an injury that would affect his pitching. So I think that this could end up being an opportunity to get some value if his ADP starts to fall because of this news.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I am also not treating him as too injured to draft. I think maybe we should treat him as more of a risk than the average pitcher, but I don't know about way more. I think that's where I come down at the minute. There's also, though, the issue that he's not the only really good reliever in Toronto, and he hasn't officially been handed the job yet. The Blue Jays also brought back Jimmy Garcia, who they traded away midseason to the Mariners. Now, he did deal with some late-season elbow issues, so health concerns there as well, but he was in the form of his life last season. Are you treating Hoffman as the guy? Would you be drafting him along with other basically certain closers, or would you be putting him maybe near the top of the maybe closer tier?
I would say the latter, maybe bottom of the sure closers, top of the part-time closers, since we're not sure. Maybe as spring rolls along, we'll get a better idea of how they view him. But I mean, from my perspective, he looks like the best option there. They do also sort of have this collection of eighth inning type guys. So maybe they'll, split the job a little bit. But, his ratios and everything were so good last year that I think that he can really provide some value, even if he's not the 100% full-time closer.
I think that's a good point. We've already seen him be that guy, and he was useful on fantasy teams. I should mention Chad Green as well. Thanks to Uncle Ted for pointing that out. He had
Erik
17 saves in Toronto.
Yeah.
Swanson there as well. So they could go with a committee in which Hoffman probably gets 40 to 60% of the saves or something, but that's certainly a possibility there. Let's move from the Blue Jays to the Mets. We've got a couple different bits of Mets news. The first being that Jesse Winker is back in town. So not actually sure if that's great for his fantasy value. A bad park and one where he's pretty much definitely going to platoon and he's not back with a team that's going to let him steal bases for whatever weird reason he was stealing bases early last season. So maybe not great there. We also have the Mets saying that they're moving on from Pete Alonso. Mark Vientos going to be the first baseman, it seems like. So the fringes of this Mets lineup are looking kind of interesting for a team that's, this good and with this high of a payroll. Third base is what? Brett Beatty, Ronnie Mauricio eventually, Luis Angel Acuna. What are we doing there?
Maybe they're looking to sign a third baseman. Maybe this is an indication that they're going to go after Bregman or somebody like that.
That would make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of surprised to hear this. I really thought that Alonso was probably going to go back there. And, this leaves him a little bit in the lurch. Vientos maybe to first, fine, whatever. That's, his offense is what it is. And I'm not too worried about him, having an issue going to first. Third base, if they don't pick up somebody, I guess I would say Brett Beatty for now with Mauricio sort of on his heels, but neither, especially Beatty, I feel like we've kind of given him a few chances and it hasn't really worked out. So, maybe as a very, very late draft pick, you could take a chance and draft him. And if it doesn't work out right away, he's an easy drop. But I'm not excited. I should feel like the Mets shouldn't be that excited with that either. So maybe they're going to look for somebody else.
Yeah, if this is Brett Beatty's last chance as the Mets third baseman, I think it's definitely his last chance. He's had 602 major league plate appearances now, and this is his age 25 season. So he's not quite at that point where I think we should totally give up on him. But, if they give him a month at the start of the season and it doesn't look good, I think he's out. And I don't really see reason to believe that it would look good. So I would think that something like an Alex Bregman signing is more likely, given what we know the Mets are capable of financially. But until that happens, I guess Beatty, maybe Mauricio. The last note we have on Ronnie Mauricio, which was from, I believe, just yesterday, is that the Mets are not yet sure whether he'll be ready for the start of spring training. So that makes him a little bit less appealing, maybe in a 50-round draft and hold. Yeah, he's still a fine, very late pick. But let's move from the very late picks to the very early picks. That's the main topic of today's show. The first 3 rounds, we want to get both general and specific today. Let's start with the general. I've got a whole bunch of big topics to talk about. Questions like risk, questions like speed, saves. Do we need to address them early on? Let's start with the risk question. So there is that truism. You can't win your draft in the first few rounds, but you can lose it. Do you believe that? Or are you someone who avoids all of the elevated risks in the first few rounds, thinking, all right, I just got to get a solid base and I'll win the draft later? I'm a good fantasy player. I know how to find underrated gems. I just need to make sure my first 3 picks stay on the field. Or is you someone who says anyone has a price and these risky players, they come at a discount and sometimes that discount is worth taking?
Yeah, I think that, the way I would phrase it is you can't win, but you can make life a lot harder for yourself. I think that almost any losing an early pick can be overcome. I mean, there are plenty of people who lost Acuna or Strider as the first overall pick last year and ended up, making money in their leagues. But for the most part, I try to stay in a safer position with the first few picks. I think that there are plenty of positions throughout the draft that you can take a chance. And I don't really want to do it in the first few rounds. I mean, there may be some player exceptions here and there where I just really, really believe in somebody. But for the most part, I want like the steady producer who I know what I'm getting from them, who don't really have any current injury concerns coming into the season. And, that I just want to have that sense of security. So I think the other thing that, maybe to think about is that, maybe when those first few rounds, and I would like to avoid maybe some category imbalance, because if you do lose a player or have a bust in the first few rounds with somebody that you're counting on for 50 home runs or for 60 stolen bases, then trying to replace those stats with players from the free agent pool is going to be that much harder.
So, for example, Ellie De La Cruz last year, bad buy. Didn't turn out that way. Yeah. And even this year, I think that he requires such a specific draft strategy that you can either overdraft stolen bases after you take him, or you can underdraft stolen bases if something ends up happening with him. So it's something that if you want him and you believe in him, then great, that's good for you. And you just have to really, really think about how you're going to structure the rest of your draft after you take somebody like that. Yeah, it's worth looking at the projected standings when you're done a draft and see how close the stolen bases category is bunched up. If you're somebody at the top and you have Ellie De La Cruz, well, picture what would happen if he were to blow out his ACL in spring training, something terrible like that. If you lose a projected 40, 50 steals, do you lose, 8-9 points in that category? You could lose even more sometimes. So I think that's a great point. That is why going one-dimensional with some of these early players is tough. So let's talk about speed then in general. You mentioned not necessarily wanting to get the guy you're drafting just for his speed, because that can set you up for problems. But do your early hitters have to provide you speed? I think there's a thought that speed is found throughout the draft. So on the one hand, we could just get the big 4-category studs and find some guys who can run later. But the opposing thought is, well, the speed that's found early is attached to good stats in other categories, whereas the speed that's found late is kind of all on its own. So do you really try to have all your first few hitters be 5-category guys, or are you open to a 4-category masher?
This is actually something that I think I'm going to adjust a little bit for this upcoming year. Full disclosure, I didn't have a great year last year. And in the past couple years, I've had a problem with having a good team, which is, great. That's a good accomplishment, but it's not been a winning team. And I think that I have tended to be maybe a little bit safe and a little bit too focused, one-dimensional sort of focused. So I'm trying to rethink where I can make some adjustments. And I think one of them is with this. So I've always been somebody who almost just crosses off players in the first few rounds that don't give me any speed. And I end up with maybe adequate speed, but struggling a little bit in power. So I think what I'm going to do, in the past, I wanted to have some speed with every pick. So trying to spread it out, trying to always get speed. But I think that maybe I'm going to reverse that a little bit this year and try to get power with every pick, and then get additional speed, have more than, 5-category type guys, so speed and power guy as much as I can. That's a lot easier said than done. So, as I think we're going to get to, I also in the past have drafted early pitching. So, something's got to give there. I think that the hitters that are early that can provide both power and speed are just so valuable. And I'm going to try to keep my focus maybe this year a little bit more on power and try to back off the speed a little bit, hoping that I'm going to get it a little bit later, get it in free agency, with the balance of also not trying to get those rabbits, those guys that only steal later. So it's very difficult to do. It's a balancing act, and I'm still kind of working on how I'm going to make that happen, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring up. I think some of my bad teams from last year, the speed was still good and nothing else was, and I should do a bit more of a closer postmortem on those teams. I bet that part of the reason was I was focusing too much on making sure my most expensive guys had speed and not thinking enough about whether or not they also had enough power. I think that was an Ellie De La Cruz team, one of them that I'm thinking of there. So maybe he was the wrong pick after all. Let's move to the mound in the early rounds. How important is it to leave the first 3 rounds with an ace? Are you really sitting down every time and saying, I really would prefer to get one here? Are you open to 2? Are you open to none? How do you approach pitchers in the first 3 rounds?
In the past, I have always been in favor of drafting early starters. I don't recall a time when I fully went pocket aces, both first and second round, but I've definitely done second, third round. I've done first, third round, something like that to keep, that early pitching. And it can be really nice to have 2 starters that you can just start every week. You don't care what the opponent is. They just come through for you with, maybe the occasional exception. It's just like such a weight off your shoulders. So, I've enjoyed doing that, but I think that, it can come at the expense of hitting. So I think I need to investigate whether that's still the way to go. I mean, I think that pitching is a little bit deeper this year than it's been before. So maybe 1 pitcher in the first few rounds instead of 2, and trying to sort of attack that middle ground of pitching might end up being the way to go. But if I'm going to draft an early pitcher, I want to be very conscious of both wins and whip. Wins are obviously unpredictable, but drafting somebody from a team, obviously, that's going to win more, and a player that we think is going to pitch further into games is important. And also whip can sometimes be overlooked. In the past, guys like Dylan Cease, Blake Snell, Luis Castillo back before he went to Seattle, those guys that can really get the walks up there. If your first pitcher has over a 1.2 whip, it's going to be real hard to make up for that with pitchers in the later rounds.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's something that I brought up in my first podcast of the year with Michael Govier. One of my New Year's resolutions for this season is pay more attention to whip. I think that some of the pitchers you mentioned are guys that I often look at in the early rounds, and you are set in some areas, but not all of them. And if you're going to invest in an early pitcher, you can have 1 fewer hitter than a lot of your league mates in those first few rounds. Do you really want to invest in one who's actively hurting you in one area? I think that's definitely something worth thinking about. One more question on the pitching side. The first closers going in round 3 in these 15-team NFBC drafts, and I think in many other formats, that's when you'll start to see them, maybe in rounds 4, 5, 6 in other types of leagues. But in leagues where the first closers do go in round 3, will you pay that price? Man, the hitters that you're passing on, the opportunity cost, if you're going in round 3, is a lot higher than it is if you're waiting to grab the first closers in round 5 or 6. Is it worth it?
Yeah, in the past, I still am very open to drafting an early closer. Similar to the starting pitchers, it's a weight off your shoulders to have a closer just set in place that you start every week. It's oftentimes hard to get both an early starter and an early closer. So sometimes you might have to choose which one you might want. And maybe if you have multiple teams, you do one plan in one league and another plan in another league. But the main strategy that I've always said when drafting, being willing to draft early closers, is that you are going to pay for saves. There's no getting around it. Unless you get incredibly lucky and hit on every late round closer that you draft, you're going to be paying for saves. So either you're going to pay for it in the draft or you're going to pay for it in free agency. And trying to chase saves in free agency is a stress that I just don't need in my life. So I try to avoid it if at all possible. I like to get one early if I get too early, that in a particular draft, that might work out. And then you might be really set and not even have to think about closers the rest of the draft or in free agency. But I would like to get at least one that I feel like has a solid hold on the job.
I think that's a good point. But one thing that I can't generally bring myself to do is take the first closer. I don't know what the closer prices are going to be yet. And if we're talking about these first 3 rounds, unless you're picking in the back few picks of the round, the question is probably, I guess, about Emmanuel Clase and opening the closer run. Are you comfortable doing that? If nobody's started the closer run yet, and you don't know whether this room is hot or cold on closers, are you fine saying, I don't care, I need a closer, and I drew the 4th pick, Emmanuel Clase is still there, I'm going to start the closer run?
I would be willing to do it in the right situation. I think that closers are, we're going to talk a little bit later about KDS and where you want to be in the draft order. And I think that having a plan for where you're going to draft your closers dictates a lot of what you should be thinking about for KDS, because if Class A and the first closers are going early in the 3rd round, then if you have an early pick, you probably either need to jump on that, or you're going to get what's left over when it comes all the way back around for you at the end of the 4th. And you're probably going to be getting the 8th or 10th closer. You're not going to have that chance to get the 2nd tier, which is what I would prefer. I would prefer most of the time to get that sort of solid closer, but not pay quite as much as what people are maybe paying for Class A this year. This actually came up last year. I was I was invited to do labor draft for the first time, which was, a great honor. And I was at the 14th pick. And it got to me in the 3rd round, and a couple of closers had gone. So I thought, I'm going to jump in and do this. And I took one in both the 3rd and 4th round. So I went double closers. Paul Sporer was on the end with me. And actually, unbeknownst to me, we had the same plan. So we ended up taking 4 closers in a row. And in that particular situation, it didn't work out that great. And as the draft went on, I didn't know some of these players as well as I probably should have. And there was some closer values that could have been had in the 6th, 7th, 8th rounds. And I regretted it a little bit. And partly it was because my 2 closers that I took were Edwin Diaz and Yohan Duran. So I didn't get the numbers from those 2 picks that I thought I was going to get. So I think that where you are in the draft, you're going to have to think about your closer plan. And if you're early and you have to be the one to start the run to get who you want, then that's what you have to do.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Although that also does circle in back to what we were saying about when you lose an early pick who's providing most of your value in one category, that really hurts. If you lose a round 3 closer, you're losing 60% of your projected saves. Whereas if you lose a round 3 hitter, you're losing, 10% of your projected home runs and that sort of thing. So it comes with a cost, but as you mentioned, there are reasons you got to do it sometimes as well. We're going to move on to a look at some specific cores of players you could start with these general categories in mind. Right after this quick message from RotoWire. The fantasy baseball season is just around the corner, and RotoWire has you covered for all your preseason draft prep. Customizable rankings to fit your league settings, cheat sheets for each position, extensive prospect rankings, and much more. And once your draft is complete, you can upload your league using RotoWire's My League feature to help with lineup decisions and free agent pickups throughout the season. See for yourself by heading over to rotowire.com/pod now to get free access. That's rotowire.com/pod. And welcome back to the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Erik Halterman here with Jenny Butler, going over the first 3 rounds. And we've got a visual for this part of the show, which is nice because we've got Ryan Bloomfield in the audience. Ryan remembers your infamous labor double closer.
He was
double
there.
tap.
He was there for it. Went so badly though.
I guess if you want to draft a memorable team that people will still be talking about 1 year later.
That's true. I did make news.
Let's see if I can share my screen here. Is this the correct one? Looks like it. So what we've got here is the visual view. Well, wait, that doesn't make sense. Everything's a visual view. I don't even know what they call
visual aids. We have visual aids.
Yeah, some visual aids for people following along on YouTube. This is a look at the ADP since January 1st in draft champions drafts on NFBC. And we're just going to look at different possible starts you could have from different regions of the draft. I've divided these up into different archetypes, I call them, starting with some all-in starts, and then we'll talk about some more balanced ones later. I'm looking at some possible starts for someone who really wants to make sure their speed is in good shape from the start. For example, if you're picking, let's say, 4 to 5, you could start with Ellie De La Cruz or Jose Ramirez. Then you could add maybe Jazz Chisholm, although he's gone a little bit earlier. Maybe Trey Turner. Then you can go Michael Harris in round 3. Or if you were picking late in the draft and you wanted to get 3 speed guys, you could start with Francisco Lindor or Julio Rodriguez. Then you could add Jackson Chourio at the second part of the turn, and then probably O'Neal Cruz, or maybe dipping down into CJ Abrams or Wyatt Langford when it comes back in late round 3. We talked about how you might not be going for one of these starts where you're really prioritizing speed with all 3 of your early picks, although there are certainly people who like that approach. Either of those regions of the draft look particularly appealing for a collection of players who give you good speed?
Yeah, I think that if you're focused on speed, this is a way to think about it. I think that what you've done here, setting this up, is really what I like to do when I'm getting ready for drafts. Think about archetypes, and then maybe in how you want to build with those archetypes. And then from that, you can look within those to pick the players that you like best within those. But this kind of exercise is really good to do because, when you look at what is available to you in the early part of the draft in the first 3 rounds versus the late part, it can be very different choices. And maybe when you're in an early pick, a speed focused build makes more sense. And if you're in a late pick, maybe you'll be more power, things like that. Not necessarily in this particular year, but I think that these speed teams look pretty nice. Ellie or Jose Ramirez are, a solid speed. I personally would probably go with Jose Ramirez just because I feel like he's more of a solid contributor all around. I have I've done not only one Gladiator in Arizona, and I did take Jazz Chisholm in that one. Trey Turner is maybe a little underrated, but having that speed in 1, 2, and 3, you've spread it out a little bit. Obviously Ellie is a huge share, but you've spread it out a little bit, and you have speed coming from every one of those picks. And in this case, every one of those guys, save for maybe Trey Turner, also provides you power. So I don't think that you are necessarily sacrificing that much to get the speed. When you're looking at maybe towards the end of the draft, picks 14 and 15 example there, Lindor and Julio Rodriguez, great. Chourio, a little bit risky with the second-year player, but still good. And then when you get into the 3rd round, it gets a little bit dicier, partly because of ADP-wise what's been going there. You're kind of, if you're really looking for speed, you're kind of reaching a little bit. But you start to get into somebody like a CJ Abrams who's starting to give you a little bit of a hole in power. So I think that these strategies can be really good, but I wouldn't necessarily force a reach in order to try and do it.
Yeah, so maybe if you fall into that pick 14, 15 round, go for the 2 early speed guys. Go with a Julio, Jackson Chourio pairing, and then maybe add a pitcher or a closer in round 3 rather than going all in. What if we look at all in on the other direction, on the offensive side? I call this category team dingers. I've got a friend in my home league who is really more of a football guy, but he plays fantasy baseball, and he calls his team dingers, and his goal is to win home runs, and he wins home runs. Usually has a middle of the pack team otherwise, but wins home runs. So these are the way that Carl might start his team. If he's around pick 2 to 3, you could go Aaron Judge, Ketel Marte, Manny Machado. Or if maybe in the middle of the draft, you could go Juan Soto, Freddie Freeman, Rafael Devers. What do you think of either of those starts? Somebody who wants to really just be well ahead of the field in all power categories, but is going to be trailing in pitching and speed as well. Is that a start you're open to?
Maybe not quite this extreme, but it's pretty interesting to look at. Judge, Marte, and Machado is nice when you're looking at team dingers. I mean, Carl would be pleased. And Soto, Freeman, and Devers also are a really solid foundation. They also are guys pretty over across the board. I would say there's some questionable average in there, but they're also pretty much guys who are going to get you power and batting average, which can be hard to get later in the draft. You can find power in later in the draft, but getting power and average can be rough. So I think that these combinations of hitters just feel really solid and really dependable. And but you're giving up something. You're giving up the fact, you have some holes that you're going to need to come back from with having no speed and no pitching in those first 3 rounds. So if you can plan for it and you're willing to potentially take a rabbit, a speed only guy later on, these feel like really good first 3 round hitter picks.
Yeah, I like both of these approaches. I think it's just a really comfortable place to be in when you know that you are ahead of the field. I mean, nobody else, unless I guess you're in a league where both of these starts are in existence, nobody else is really going to be close to you, I think, in homers and RBI. And that's a pretty good place to be through 3 rounds. Let's flip it to the other side. If you're going to emphasize pitching early, what if you emphasized it so hard you went for pocket aces? Well, the only true pocket ace start I can see, well, there might be a couple possibilities. I'm seeing Paul Skeens and Garrett Crochet, followed by any hitter if you're around pick 8 to 10 or so. If you're near the end of the draft, it looks like you could probably actually go Tarek Skubal and Zach Wheeler at the turn, followed by, well, I think the reason I didn't initially include that is there aren't many hitters going in the end of round 3 at the moment. So you'd be looking at, I guess, O'Neal Cruz or dipping into some hitters who are typically going in round 4 if you wanted to go Skubal, Wheeler. You could also do not quite the truest pocket aces. You could start with a hitter and then go, say, Garrett Crochet and Logan Gilbert, or maybe Corbin Burns and Jacob deGrom if you're in somewhere at the middle part of the draft. So it looks like you're going to have to be middle or near the back if you want to go pocket aces. If you're open to it, which of those possible configurations looks most interesting to you?
Yeah, I think that for this season, it doesn't feel too comfortable to force a pocket aces strategy. I think that, looking at this draft board here, Skubal and Wheeler, that seems great. But then you're forcing that 3rd round pick, that hitter a little bit. The place that this most appeals to me is when I have an early pick. So if I can get just an absolute stud of a hitter with my first pick, like let's say a Bobby Witt, or assuming that Ohtani can do some percentage of what he did hitting last year. If you have that just all around 5 category stud, then going pitcher in rounds 2 and 3 can really set you up with, a solid pitching floor too. So, having a Bobby Witt with a Gilbert and a Sale, or, maybe going starter closer, Crochet and Burns, those can really be a solid start that kind of keeps you open to all kinds of directions going forward in the draft, because you've really set yourself up with a solid foundation across all of your hitting and pitching categories.
So looking at the way the ADP chart falls right now, it's probably going to require Logan Gilbert to fall a bit if you're to do that pocket aces from the start of the draft. Or would you consider, say, from pick 1 or 2, you go Ohtani or Witt, and then you reach for Chris Sale, move him up a few spots, and then also move Corbin Burns up a few spots? Would you accept a Ohtani, Sale, Burns pocket aces start?
I think that the idea of that is good. I'm not sure that those specific players, I would feel great about doing that. So, Chris Sale obviously had a great season, but he is getting older, and I don't know. I mean, he hasn't done that in years. So, I don't know that I'm going to count on that to be repeated. And Burns is he's solid, but maybe not as spectacular as he used to be, and is in a new place. So I think a lot of it depends on what the build of, the landscape of players looks like this year, and not trying to force a strategy. So I like the idea of the strategy maybe a little bit more than the actual players that are available right there. And, that may mean that that's not the strategy for this time, this year at, this situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The actual players who will be carrying out the strategy are unfortunately more important than the strategy itself. You could spend all the time you want coming up with a perfect plan, but got to get the right players, and the right players might not be available this year. One final archetype, I don't know if we can call this one an archetype before we move on to some of the balanced builds. I just wanted to take a look at what your team would look like through 3 rounds if you were to draft an early closer. I think that counts as being all in on saves compared to your peers, at least through 3 rounds. So if you were to go Emmanuel Clase as your early closer and you really wanted to get him, you kind of have to have the first overall pick, or maybe pick 2 or 3 and you pull him up into the end of round 2 if you really want Emmanuel Clase. And then you're looking at, Otani Witt or Judge with Clase, and then maybe Acuna, Sale, Machado, Burns, or something, one of those players in round 3. Or we have a whole bunch of closers going near the end of round 3. There's a run of Edwin Diaz, Josh Hader, Mason Miller, and Devin Williams, all in that range. So you can go with many combinations before that. You could go pocket aces, Scooble, Wheeler, and then a closer, or you could go with, say, a Julio, Jackson Churio, get those 2 5-category guys and a closer. If you were to start with a closer in round 3, which of these possible combos appeals most?
I think the one that's towards the end of the first round, later KDS pick, looks a little bit nicer. I mean, obviously Clase is great. I'm not concerned in any way about him. So, if you getting a solid closer is a solid closer. But I'd rather, if I could, do it with a later pick, because I don't think that Clase is that far and above. That's bad phrasing. That much better than some of the guys that are going at the end of round 3. So it feels like you're forcing it a little bit to do it with an early pick. I mean, maybe if you see, you're in an early pick and you take 2 hitters first and Clase were to fall to you at the beginning of the 3rd round, that seems a little bit more appealing when you've already got 2 solid hitters. But I think that at the end of the draft, when you can do either hitter and closer, hitter pitcher closer, that seems a little bit like a more preferable option to me.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that as well. Let's move on to looking at some of the possible ways that you could get off to a nice balanced start. These are going to involve 2 hitters and 1 pitcher. I think that's the standard. By default, most people will be starting that way. Just statistically, that's what's available. So if you wanted to go 1 speed guy, 1 power guy, and an ace, you got a whole bunch of different options there. At the start of the draft, you could get your speed with Otani, Witt, or Ellie De La Cruz in the first 4 picks. So you can come around and add, say, Ketel Marte and Austin Riley, and then grab Chris Sale or Corbin Burns in round 3. Or you could get the power first. If you went Aaron Judge, you're probably looking at Trey Turner coming back in round 2, and then again Sale or Burns round 3. If we're looking late in the draft, you could get your speed in Julio Rodriguez or Francisco Lindor. And then here's where a couple power bats we haven't really talked about. They fit in nicely. You combine either Julio or Francisco Lindor with Vlad Jr. or Yordan Alvarez, and then you go grab some starter. Looks like it would be George Kirby or Dylan Cease at the tail end of round 3. So lots of different ways. I didn't pull any from the middle of the draft. I think that most possible ways to get this specific combination appear to be on both ends at the moment, although in the middle, obviously, you could pull guys up a few picks and make it work. But any of these combinations of the really basic start, 1 speed guy, 1 power guy, and 1 ace, and any of those particularly stand out to you?
This way to do it is where I like to live. So I like to leave the first 3, 4, 5 rounds with just a nice spread of stats. So, these options look a lot better to me than some of the more extreme options that we talked about earlier. So, Judge is just solid. You're going to get a bunch of home runs. Pair that with a speed guy, but I don't love the speed options at the 2-3 turn. So maybe if you have an early pick, I don't love that as much. In the middle there, there's some speed with like maybe go a Corbin Carroll, Bryce Harper, or Corbin Carroll, Garrett Crochet, Matt Olson kind of start would be nice. I've done 2 drafts this year. The first one that I did was we started all the way back in August, and I had the 15th pick, and I started with Lindor and Vlad Guerrero. And I still feel good about that. It's something that I would do again. So I think that, getting a Lindor Guerrero closer, Lindor Guerrero starting pitcher, or, like a Lindor Zach Wheeler and, a hitter there. I just think that there's just so many options for this sort of strategy, and I almost don't see any here that I don't like, other than maybe, like I said, there's not a ton of speed right there at that 2-3 turn.
Yeah, I think that is definitely something I'm noticing as well. If you do like this start, I guess you probably are going to not want to take Judge then in round 1. You're going to want to get Ohtani, Witt, or Elly De La Cruz in those first couple picks, and then come back with probably Trey Turner. One other way to do a balanced team, 2 5-category hitters and 1 ace. So if we throw out the power bats that we were talking about in the last section, a whole ton of ways to do this because, the 5-category hitters tend to go at the start of the draft. I'll pick out a few from different regions. If you're a pick, say 1 or 2, you could start with Ohtani or Witt and then pair them with probably Ronald Acuna. You'd have to be comfortable taking that injury risk because there's not necessarily a lot of 5-category guys at that 2-3 turn. You're probably adding Chris Sale as your ace there, or maybe Corbin Burns. If you're in the middle of the draft, here's where I think you got a whole ton of options. The middle of that first round is full of just solid 5-category guys. Jose Ramirez, Gunnar Henderson, Kyle Tucker in round 1. And then you could go with another 5-category hitter, Jackson Merrill, Jazz Chisholm, and then add, say, Corbin Burns, maybe Jacob deGrom. Or you can flip that, or you go Garrett Crochet in round 2. And then you're probably looking at Michael Harris as the only 5-category hitter in that range in round 3. Or then, hey, if you're at the end of the draft, some players we've talked about several times here, Julio or Francisco Lindor as your 5-category stud at the end of round 1. And then probably pairing him with Zach Wheeler, and then going O'Neill Cruz or Wyatt Langford, probably pulling them at the end of round 3. So this is maybe the default of default approaches, even more than the power plus speed plus ace. This is the way that if you're sitting down and have no specific plan, this is probably the way you're going to go. So what part of the draft do you want to be in if you're going to start in this very conventional fashion?
Yeah, I think that, even just, you looking at this and trying to pick out the options, we run into a little bit of a problem again in the early section with trying to get a 5-category guy. So I personally am not going to be taking Acuna at the start of the 3rd round, but, you put somebody like him in there and I'd be totally fine with that. This is really what I like to do as much as I can. In the early rounds, the 5-category bats are just so valuable. Not leaving yourself with a hole anywhere coming out of your first couple of hitters is just such a nice place to be. And you can really leave yourself all kinds of options later in the draft. So I think the middle, that Gunnar Henderson, Kyle Tucker area there, and there's a lot of good options in the 2nd and 3rd rounds there. That seems really nice. Also at the end seems pretty good too. So I think depending on where you're drafting, this could really be a good option if you're in the middle or the end.
Yeah, I think that that's something that I wasn't totally thinking about when we sat down for this episode, but there really is a gap at the 2-3 turn in true 5-category hitters. This is between Jackson Merrill, who's going about the middle of round 2, and Michael Harris, who's going the middle of round 3. There's 12 players in here where I'd say the only true 5-category hitter is Ronald Acuna Jr., and I don't know if I want to take that risk. The players are Freddie Freeman, William Contreras, Logan Gilbert, Trey Turner, Ketel Marte, Emmanuel Clase, Austin Riley, Ronald Acuna Jr., Chris Sale, Manny Machado, Corbin Burns, and Rafael Devers. Those are all of the guys who are going really the expanded turn. The first 6 picks will be choosing mainly between those players at the 2-3 turn. Now, those are not bad players by any means. They're going at the 2-3 turn for a reason. But if you really want 2 5-category bats or even 3, probably don't set your KDS in the first 5. I think that's maybe what I'm thinking. So based on what we talked about, is there a region of the draft that you really want to start in this year? Is it anything but the first 5 because you want to avoid that turn, or do you like the first 5 for other reasons?
So getting a pick in the first 5 is just feels so nice when you're in the first round, but you really need to take a look at what's going to be available around even further than this, the 2-3 turn, the 4-5 turn, things like that, and really try to map it out. You can make it work from any spot. Generally, I personally like to be in the middle because I feel like I have a lot more options. I don't get caught in runs, closer runs, catcher runs, things like that. I don't get caught off guard. But, even with KDS, you don't always get the pick that you want. So you need to make it work. And this particular exercise is pretty much exactly what I like to do going into a draft. I do the NFBC main events in Las Vegas, and we know our draft slot 5 days before, I think it is. So once I find out my draft spot, I really want to sit down and map this out, and not just what my best option, my favorite choices are, but, I want to have a second, third, and fourth plan where, if I'm thinking that in the first round, I just have to get Julio Rodriguez and then he goes before me, I don't want to be caught scrambling. So I want to sit down with my draft pick and really just map out multiple options. And then from those multiple options, have my number 1 favorite plan, and then 2, 3, and 4 plans after that.
And so when you're doing that mapping, are you going 3 rounds deep, or are you going even deeper than that? I think I've heard of some people, sounds like they go, 10, 12 rounds. And I wonder how useful it is to be predicting, 14 other drafters' behavior that deep into the draft. But have you found it useful to go at least, 5, 6 rounds deep?
Yeah, I generally go pretty deep. It's not as predictable. You're not going to be able to have, a solid handle on who's going to be there, especially with something like the main events in Las Vegas. People will reach to get their guys. There are people who will just catch fire within that little Vegas bubble and will be gone 3 rounds before you thought they would. So, it's important to be flexible, but I like to sit down. Usually what I do, I sat down and did this in the morning before our Glarf draft last year, sat there and wrote it all out. I look at what are my speed options, power options, and pitching options at each pick. And I usually go 6 to 10 rounds deep. And what you can see from it, not only is, what your options are, but there are times when you start to look sort of like we just did, and there's just this gap, and, maybe your 2-3 turn of speed guys, or, there's a gap in the 5-6 of quality pitching, and it can help to lead your earlier picks, knowing that, if I take 3 hitters early and then I just think I'm going to get a pitcher in rounds 5 and 6, well, maybe the pitchers that I like aren't going to be there then. So maybe that should inform my earlier round picks based on what's going to be available later. And it's not 100% predictable, but I think it's a good thought exercise to sit there and work through it, and, almost like pretend that you are having a draft in your head. Well, if these guys go and this is what's available to me, what am I going to do? And it's when there's that 1 minute clock going, you need to not be making these decisions on the clock.
That's a good point. So the other part about setting your KDS, choosing which part of the draft you want to pick from, is just personal preference of, do you like being on the middle or do you like being on the ends? So I've got a 2-parter here. 1, do you like being on the middle or the ends? And 2, do you allow that to outweigh the specific player-based considerations we've talked about and say, all right, I'm an ends drafter, let me find the end that has the players I like? Or do you just say, it's the players that matter, and I just got to get used to drafting middle end, whatever?
I generally I like to be in the middle. I find it more comfortable. Sometimes being on the end is nice because you can take care of 2 needs in one shot. But the players that are there really only matter for the first few rounds, and then it's sort of a free for all. So I try to stay towards the middle and maybe push it a little bit towards, maybe I'll go a little 4, 5, 6 if I like the earlier options, or maybe I'll go 8, 9, 10 if I like the later options. But I generally try to stay away from the absolute ends.
All right, that's good to know. And then the final question I've got on the list here, well, I think I should reword it. I've written it as how much time should someone really spend thinking about KDS? I think your answer is going to be at least a pretty good amount based on what we've talked about. But I want to modify it slightly and say, when you finish coming up with your order, does it end up looking like a real mess? Is it so specific that you've got it down to, well, I want 2, then 5, then 4, then 8, then 12? Is it a jumbled mess where you put that much work into it? Or is it really just, you know what, I want the early bit. If I can't get the early bit, I want the end. So I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Does it tend to be in big chunks like that, or is it really fine-tuned?
Yeah, it's more in big chunks. So what I'll do a lot of times is, which area am I most comfortable with? Let's say for this particular conversation, I think that there's a top 6 players that are really just head and shoulders above everybody else. Well, what I'll do then is put my KDS order as 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, because whatever I will have a better second round option coming back. Or, if I generally want to be at the end, I'll kind of put that chunk of later picks there. And maybe you could make it a little more specific within that chunk. But like I said, for me personally, I try to sort of get the middle picks as my better or higher options and then work my way out towards the ends.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap up our discussion of KDS and our discussion of the first 3 rounds. Hopefully, we helped you listeners with some of the general things to think about, and also a look at some of the specific regions of the draft this year that look appealing for different types of strategies. It really did stand out to me how much of a dead zone that 2-3 turn is for 5 category players. Something to think about if you wind up in that zone. Maybe should I be moving Aaron Judge down my draft list for that reason? I don't know. Something to think about for sure. But thank you very much, Jenny, for your time. Looking forward to drafting with you in Detroit for the Glarf draft next month. Anything you're working on? Anything you want to plug on your way out here?
Yeah, the only thing really I have to plug right now is that I did write a piece for the FTN draft guide. I got some really great input from a lot of really good players in the NFBC about building your bench. And it was really enlightening to me to see what the best players in the game are doing, what kinds of things they're thinking about when they're building their bench. And so I put all of those comments together and tried to sort of make a story out of it. And I think it ended up pretty good. I'm going to try to follow this up with some of the input that I got on in-season managing of your bench. So I'm going to try to get that out before opening day. But other than that, I work during the season on the FTN weekly projections. So when you see those projections come out, the playing time portion of it is been, I've had list last year, the NL side of the playing time portion of it. So that's been an interesting exercise, and I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of work, but one that will definitely help you stay very in tune with who's getting all the playing time in the NL this season. Really intrigued by that bench strategy article as well. Can you tease us one strategy tidbit from that? Is my plan of just trying to jam as many pitchers as I can onto my bench, is that in line with the best experts?
It is there. I got that answer from a lot of people, and I think that that's changed a lot since I first started in this higher stakes fantasy world. People are really starting to drift towards having a more pitcher heavy bench. But the thing that I think I learned most from it was I spend a lot of my time when I'm building my bench trying to make sure I have all my positions covered. I want to make sure I have a backup third baseman and a backup shortstop. And I remember last year I would draft, a guy like Jared Triolo so that I would have second and third base eligibility. And when you see what the best players are doing, they are taking shots on upside. They're just trying to get a chance at having a breakout player. And if they don't have their positions covered in the first few weeks, they're willing to do that. And that seems so risky to me, but they're doing it and it's working. So I think I'm going to be a lot more open to doing that this year.
Interesting. That is definitely something I'm not open to yet. So I should read the article and get open to it myself. Check that out. I'm sure you will have plenty to learn about building a bench. And thank you all for listening. Thank you again, Jenny. We'll be back next week on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast.